The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, and she said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked inside and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood that the scripture said that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Meanwhile, Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she stooped and looked inside. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken my Lord away," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned and she saw somebody standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought that it was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which means in Hebrew, teacher. "Do not cling to me," Jesus said, "because I still have not yet ascended to my Father. But go, find my brothers and sisters, and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." And then she gave them his message. A word inspired by God. The notion of physical resurrection is really problematic. If we were to subscribe to the typical Christian idea that at the end of time, that some angel is going to blow a trumpet and that all the bodies that have ever been, 111 billion human beings who have lived since the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens, are all going to pick themselves up, figure out where did I leave my femur and my kidney, reassemble the whole package, and come back for some kind of a general, revelation, there's going to be a big problem. Partly because every single cell in your body has been borrowed from somebody else or some other organism. There's not a single cell in your body that originally belonged to you. In actual fact, there are a limited number of molecules on planet Earth. It's a huge number, but it's actually a limited number. And with every breath you take, you transfer millions of molecules of matter with everybody else in the vicinity and with the tree. So we're constantly giving away and borrowing our stuff. And so the stuff that you've borrowed from somebody else has been borrowed by them from a third party and a fourth party and whatever. And so it goes right back to the beginning. So it's not like you one day went out and you decided to steal somebody's carport when they weren't at home, and you took all the nails out of it and took the roof off it and took the windows and the lumber and brought it home and reassembled it, and then the police found out and they come back and they force you to give back what belonged. It's like you took a nail from one carport and you took a window from another carport and you took a piece of lumber for a third carport and you borrowed from hundreds of different carports and you made your own carport, and now you've been found out and you have to give back the nail to the person it belonged to, only to find out that he'd actually stolen that nail from somebody else, who had stolen it from somebody else, who had stolen it from somebody else. So there's going to be a lot of kilele on the last day when people are trying to figure out who belonged to whom, which molecule belonged to you. So obviously physical resurrection is problematic. The second problem with it is that if we raise our physical bodies, then heaven has to be some kind of a geographical location. And it must be someplace, if Jesus is traveling at the speed of light for the last 2,000 years going to heaven, and if he's already reached there, then heaven must be someplace within the Milky Way galaxy, even if he's traveling at the speed of light. So heaven then has to be some kind of a physical location. And the third big problem with it, if we believe in a physical resurrection, it must mean then that Eucharist is a cannibalistic rite. So that somehow we're eating the body of Jesus Christ. And in fact, that was the accusation made against them by the Roman world in which they lived. That they had secreted a cadaver somewhere, and that every week they'd go and they'd take a chunk off it, feast on it, and they'd come back the week afterwards. So these are the problems with the notion of physical resurrection. So that's what I want to examine this morning. And I'm going to make 4 main points. The first one, I will ask myself the question, what do we mean by body? The second one, I'll talk about the cross of resurrection. Then thirdly, I'm going to ask myself, what does he appeared mean? And then finally, what does truth mean? So the first one is, which body are we talking about? The problem in the West is that we only have one word for body, and we got this really impoverished notion. We think the body is this thing here, which is composed basically just of a musculoskeletal system, and a cardiovascular system, and an endocrine system, and an immune system, and a nervous system. We're just this package of stuff. Now, we act as if, that we just have this one human body, and it's like when you're born, it's about 20 inches long and about 9 pounds of weight. It's like a balloon that hasn't been inflated yet, and you blow into it and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you're about age 26. You can max out at age 26, and thereafter, the air begins to escape from the balloon, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But it's basically the same balloon. It's just different sizes depending on how much air you put into it. That's how the West acts, as if there's this one body, and you blow into it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it shrinks down smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a really impoverished notion of body. You look at other civilizations, and they're much, much more sophisticated. You look at the ancient Egyptian system, and there are at least 2 kinds of bodies. They call it Ka and Ba. Ba is the physical, body, and then Ka is like the energy template of which the physical body is hard copy, or is a printed out version of it. You go to the ancient Persians, and they've got exactly the same notion. They talk about Fravashi, and Fravashi is like the energy template out of which the physical body is finally constructed from molecular stuff. The Greeks had 3 different words for body. They talked about sarx, soma, and pneuma. Sarx was the flesh and blood body, and soma was the psychical body, and pneuma was the spiritual body. The Hindus had a much more sophisticated model even than that. They talked about 7 different levels of body. So there's the physical body, which is vibrating between 400 nanometers and 700, between infrared and ultraviolet, so we can actually see it. But when it dies, it's just redistributed molecularly back into the ecosystem. Beyond that, vibrating at a higher level, says Hinduism, is the etheric body, and it is the energy template, like the Ka and the Fravashi. And it survives several days after the physical body has died. But then eventually, it gets recycled as free energy back into the universe. It's the second level of body. The third level of body they call the astral body. And they say that this is the body from which we draw our emotions. And it's the place where we travel at night when we're dreaming. We inhabit this level of the self, and we travel astrally. It's the place that we experience if we have out-of-body experiences, or it's the place that is reported in near-death experiences. The body that somebody temporarily inhabits after the physical system has shut down and we've been declared clinically dead. The heart is no longer beating, and the lungs aren't working, and the brain is flatlining, but there's still a level of consciousness and a sense of personal self. And this they would call the astral body. And they claim that at the end, when somebody finally dies and the physical body is redistributed molecularly, and the etheric body goes back as free energy to the universe, that this astral body becomes the archives of all of the experiences generated in the lifetime just ended. There's a 4th level of body, says Hinduism, and that they call the mental body. It's the place, it's like Plato's ideal realm. It's the place from which we download our great ideas. There's a 5th level of body they call the causal body. And it's the place where we experience our psychic abilities, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, telepathy, precognition, all of these kinds of things. And they claim that that becomes the master archives of all of the experiences you've had in all of the lifetimes and all of the incarnations you've ever lived. And then there's a sixth level, which they call Atman, which is kind of the individual soul, the bite-sized piece of God, the sparks, the Sephirot that came from Source. And then the final one is Brahma body, your cosmic consciousness or ultimate source or God. So it's a much more complex system. Tibetan Buddhism has this beautiful notion of what they call the rainbow body. And they claim that some of the great avatars, when it comes to dying, that they sit in meditation and they drop the physical body. And the physical body actually disappears into a light body. They call it the rainbow body. And all that's left is the clothing. And occasionally, for some reason or other, pieces of hair and a few teeth. But that everything else dissolves literally into a rainbow body. Now, that's not actually so far-fetched, because when you think about it, the human body is basically composed of light. So a typical human body has about 70 trillion cells, or roughly 10 to the power of 14 cells. But every cell has about 10 to the 14 atoms in it, and each atom has a photon of light attached. So that's 10 to the power of 28 photons of light in the human body. If you could release the light in a single human body, this is a scientific fact, we don't know how to do it yet, but if we could do it, if you could release the light in a single human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. And so we're basically light bodies. So my belief system is that light and sound dance together. They're the two great creative forces in the universe. And light comes in many, many different levels of density, and sound comes in many, many different kinds of frequencies. And depending on the density of light and the frequency of sound, they create various kinds of life forms. If you've got very, very dense light meeting very, very low frequency, you have rocks. If you get very, very subtle light meeting very, very high frequency, you get angelic beings. And the rest of us are in there someplace between. So there's a scientific basis for this as well. So the first thing that we have to ask ourselves the question then, which level of body are we talking about? When we're talking about resurrection, which level of body are we talking about? Which brings me to my second point. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 11, his first letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 11 and again in chapter 15, he addresses the idea of Eucharist and the idea of resurrection. And in order to understand Eucharist and resurrection, you have to distinguish the level of body of which Paul is speaking. Paul says very, very definitely, sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of God or inherit the kingdom of God. Sarx is this stuff here. He says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He's not talking about sarx. He's not even talking about soma. He's talking about pneuma. He's talking about the spirit body. I mean, he talks about Eucharist. He's saying that's what we're talking about. A Eucharistic encounter is not people eating stuff, which was Jesus' big toe at some stage. It's about a spiritual encounter between a much higher level of, Jesus and a much higher level of yourself. So if you come up to communion, you're a little kid who has no idea what's happening, and you wander up and you've got a piece of chewing gum in your mouth, and you stick out your tongue, and I put a host on your tongue. It's just, Jesus and Wrigley's just wrestling together for real estate inside your mouth. You're not having a Eucharistic encounter. If you come up and you're shifting your state of consciousness, then you're encountering a level of Christ consciousness, which is a real Eucharistic encounter. So in order to understand Eucharist, we have to understand which level of body we're talking about. And the same thing is true of resurrection. When Jesus is talking about resurrection, there's something very, very, very different about the body. And so the early disciples who had real encounters with this level of Christ are at pains to try to figure out, how do we explain this to people who haven't had the experience? So they come up with two different kinds of metaphors or images. And theologians call them the before-after images and the below-above images. So the before-after have to do with the fact they're really trying to impress upon people who haven't had the experience, it really was he. It was the same Jesus we knew before he died that we encountered after the resurrection. And so they say, for instance, he ate and he drank with us. We just heard this in the reading today. He asked for a piece of fish, and we gave him a piece of fish after his resurrection, and he actually ate it. And so it was really the same Jesus before and after. But then there's something radically different. Mary today didn't recognize him. She thought he was the gardener, the person who was closest to him in his adult life perhaps, and she thought he was the gardener. In Luke's account, in chapter 24 of Luke's Gospel, there's this great story that on the day of resurrection, two disciples are walking from Jerusalem to a little village called Emmaus, and they're talking about what had just happened in Jerusalem over the last few days. And this stranger walks up behind them, and he says, "Hey guys, what are you talking about? You were really animated there for a while. What's up?" And they said, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's happened there in the last few days?" He says, no, what happened? I don't have a radio. Clue me in. And say, you didn't hear about Jesus of Nazareth? We thought he was going to be the Messiah, and he got killed. And now today, some women tell us that they went to the tomb and it's empty. And Christ begins going through the Hebrew scriptures and begins to open their eyes. So they come to the village of Emmaus. They still don't recognize him. And they're going to spend the night in the village. And he pretends he's going to go on further. And says, no, stay with us. Have a meal with us. So they go into a little inn, and the bread and the wine arrives, and he starts the bracha over the bread and wine. And all of a sudden their eyes are opened, and they recognize that it is he. So there's something different as well. He's able to appear in rooms where the doors are locked. He can, as it were, kind of deconstitute and reconstitute, as if he could take his molecular structure, make it disappear, and relocate itself. So that's the kind of the below above. So there's two sets of images. It really was the same guy we knew before and after, but there's something radically different about him. He's transformed. So there you have the cross of resurrection. So as the connection between the before-after is the time element, and the below-above is the space element. So in some senses, it's that this level of body conquers both time and space. It's beyond time and it's beyond space. So that's the image then. Which brings me to my third point. I'm going to look then at the notion of he appeared. The New Testament is written in Greek, and the verb which is used in the Greek that's translated into English as he appeared. It is not a videotapable sense. Rather, the Greek verb gives the impression that he chose to make himself visible to. So it's not like if Jesus appeared standing in front of this lectern here, and I said, look, there he is, and we all look, we're all going to see him. It's not so much that it's a videotapable event. It has to do with to whom is he choosing to make himself visible, in the sense that who's ready for an encounter at that level of the psyche. Now it's interesting that it's the same Greek verb that's used in the story of the Transfiguration, this great story where Jesus takes Peter and James and John up to the top of a mountain, and he has a powerful vision, so powerful that the others also can see the vision. And he has an encounter with Elijah and with Moses. Now Elijah had left the earth 800 years before Jesus, and Moses had died 1250 years before Jesus. And somehow these two beings are there. And so they're using the very same verb. For some reason, Moses and Elijah chose to make themselves visible to this group. Because Moses represented the law, and Elijah represented the prophets, which are the two great first parts of the Tanakh, Torah and Nebi'im, the law and the prophets. They represent those two parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. So it's the very same verb. It's the same verb we find again in the Acts of the Apostles on the road to Damascus, where Paul has an encounter with Jesus. And now at this stage, Jesus is gone 6 years before Paul has his encounter. But this appearance is not a visual phenomenon, it's an acoustical phenomenon. Paul hears a voice, and the voice says to him, Saul, which was his earlier name, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he says, who are you? And he says, I'm Jesus, and you're persecuting me. And he falls off his horse and is blinded. But nobody else in the group that's with him heard any of these voices. And so either whether it's a visual or an acoustical image, it has to do with the state of consciousness in which the person finds themselves. So use your kind of a simple example. I remember shortly after I came to Palo Alto in 1987, I'm walking down University Avenue here in Palo Alto, and there was a Woolworth store there at that stage. If any of you remember the Woolworth store. And I wanted to buy a few binders for college classes that I was taking. So I'm looking in the window to see if I can see binders. But because of where I'm standing, and because of the position of the sun, there's a sheen on the window. I can't see through the glass. All I can see is my own reflection. So it's frustrating, trying to look in to see if there's in there what I want, but all I can see is myself. And then all of a sudden, I figured out if I can soften my gaze somehow, all of a sudden it changes, and now I can see through the glass, and I can see the contents of the window, not just my own reflection. So it's not like the stuff wasn't there. It was, I had to do something visually. I had to shift my focus or soften my gaze or enter a different state of consciousness in order to see what's already inside there. That's the sense of the verb to appear. It has to do with the mindset, or more importantly, the soul set of the person in order to be able to have a particular kind of encounter. Which brings me to my last point. What does truth mean? There's a famous dialogue in John's Gospel where Jesus is being tried in front of Pontius Pilate. And at one stage, Christ says to him, anybody who's interested in the truth will listen to what I have to say. And Pilate says, dismiss truth. What's that? Pilate had come from the Greco-Roman world in which there was all different kinds of philosophies, and every group was claiming we have the truth. And so Pilate was up to there with the notion of truth. So he says to Jesus, what is truth? So what is truth? There's a huge difference between truth and fact. Something can be factual, but not true, and something can be true, but not factual. So there's a very, very big difference. The fact is something which is just, accurate in the physical world in which we find ourselves. My definition of truth is the following. I say that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So for me, that's what truth is about. It's not about just facts. Facts may not be true, and truth may not be factual. So what do I mean? So for instance, it is now 10:15. That's a fact. Is it true? Are you radically transformed because it's 10:15 right now? It doesn't make a damn difference. It could be 10:16 or 10:25, whatever. It's not going to transform you. So it's factual, but it's not truthful. Something can be truthful, but not factual. One of my favorite examples is a parable Jesus tells one time when he's been interrogated and they want to know, what do you mean by, who is my neighbor? What do you mean by neighbor? And Jesus says, okay, I'll explain neighbor to you. Once upon a time, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged, fell among robbers, and they beat him up and left him half dead on the side of the road. And a few hours later, a priest from the temple was going down, and he saw this fellow lawnsman lying at the side of the road, and he just ignored him and kept going. And sometime later, a Levite, who were the temple police, was passing by, and he sees him, and he passes by. And then some hours later, a Samaritan passes by, and he sees this Jewish man lying aside the road, picked him up, attended to him, put him on his own donkey, brought him down to Jericho, checked in at an inn, looked after him for 3 or 4 days, and then said to the innkeeper, I need to go on a journey, I want you to look after this man, and when I come back, I'll fix up the tab with you. And then Jesus says, which of these 3 people was neighbor to him who fell among the robbers? Now, imagine you were a reporter from the Jerusalem Post, and you hear Jesus telling this, and you say, there's something fishy about that story. I'm going to check that out. And you go over to the temple, you knock at the door, and the high priest comes out, and you say, here's the deal. I just heard a guy telling a story that one of you guys went down to Jericho in the last few days, and you saw a man lying at the side of the road, and you totally ignored him. Is that true? And the high priest says, let me just check. And he calls it, guys, here's the story. Any of you guys down in Jericho in the last week? No. None of us was down there. So I go over to where the Levites live, and I knock at the door, and I say, here's the deal. I heard a story that one of you went down to Jericho a few days ago, and you saw a fellow Jew lying at the side of the road, and you just ignored him and kept going. Can you check out for me if that's true? And the Levite goes in, and he says, guys, any of you down in Jericho for the last week? No. So I go down to Jericho, and there's only 4 or 5 inns in Jericho. I go around to each inn, and I check the books. And I ask each innkeeper, did by any chance a Samaritan come in here with a Jewish man last week who was really, really badly beaten up and offered to pay his bill? And the innkeeper says, not in this inn. And I check all the inns, and it didn't happen. So I go back up and I find Jesus, and he says, you told a crock. That never happened whatsoever. So was it factual? Probably not. Was it truth? Absolutely true. Because it radically transformed people's idea of what neighbor was. Neighbor is not just your lawnsman. Neighbor is not just the guy at the other side of the white picket fence. Neighbor is any sentient being, not just any human being, any sentient being, particularly any sentient being who's experiencing a measure of distress right now. And so when I ask myself that question then, is the resurrection of Jesus true? And I give a resounding yes. Was the experience of the resurrected Jesus true? It radically transformed the disciples. You take this bunch of people, one of whom denied 3 times that even he knew who Jesus was, Peter. The others who hid themselves in the upper room in case they too would get crucified by the Romans. And now all of a sudden, having experienced this resurrected Christ, they're willing to lay down their lives and spend the rest of their lives preaching. These bumbling fishermen who couldn't put 2 sentences together are now these eloquent preachers, every single one of whom is ready to lay down their lives for this message. So is the resurrection of Jesus true? If by truth you mean it radically transformed them permanently, then it definitely is true.